Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The man I thought I knew. When people say marriage is a journey, they don't often talk about the hidden paths, the unexpected detours, or the doors you never thought to open until life forces you to. My husband, David, and I had been married for nearly a decade, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about him. We were partners in the truest sense, sharing everything from the mundane routines of daily life to the quiet, vulnerable moments of our hearts. But on one unassuming Tuesday night, I learned that even the person you trust most in the world can carry a secret so profound it changes everything. David had always been a steady, comforting presence in my life, where I was all energy and spontaneity. He was calm and deliberate. He had a way of grounding me with his quiet strength, his thoughtful gestures, and his endless patience. It was one of the many reasons I fell in love with him all those years ago. He was my rock, my anchor. But what I didn't realize until that night was that even rocks can hide layers beneath their surface. The quiet rhythm of our lives. Life with David was stable, and to be honest, predictable. We weren't the kind of couple who thrived on drama or chaos. We found joy in the simplicity of our routines, cooking dinner together, binge-watching old sitcoms, and taking long walks in the park on lazy Sunday afternoons. David worked as an engineer, a job that suited his methodical nature, while I ran a small floral shop that kept me constantly surrounded by color and creativity. Our home was modest but warm, filled with little signs of the life we built together. Framed photos from our travels, mismatched coffee mugs from thrift stores, and the faint scent of lavender from the candles I loved to light in the evenings. But there was one part of our home that I rarely ventured into: the basement. The basement was David's domain. Shortly after we moved into the house, he had claimed the space as his workshop, a place where he could tinker with tools, fix broken things, and work on what he called his projects. I didn't ask too many questions about what those projects entailed. It wasn't out of disinterest, but out of respect for his space. I had my floral shop, he had his basement. It was a balance that worked for us. An unusual sound. That Tuesday started like any other. David came home around 6, his tie loosened and his usual calm demeanor intact. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, chatting about our day while the faint sounds of rain pattered against the windows. After dinner, I stayed in the kitchen to clean up while David retreated to the basement, as he often did in the evenings. I was halfway through drying the dishes when I heard it. A loud thud, followed by a muffled curse. The sound was unusual enough to catch my attention. David wasn't the kind of man who lost his composure easily, and he rarely made much noise while working on his projects. Concerned, I set the dish towel down and called out, "David, everything okay?" "I'm fine," he shouted back, but his voice sounded strained, almost defensive. I hesitated for a moment. Normally, I would have taken him at his word and left him to his work, but something about the sound of his voice unsettled me. It wasn't like him to sound so uneasy. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check on him. Descending into his world, the stairs to the basement creaked under my weight as I made my way down, the cool air brushing against my skin. The scent of sawdust and old metal lingered in the dimly lit space, a stark contrast to the warm, floral-scented atmosphere of the rest of the house. David's workshop was a mess of organized chaos. Tools hanging from pegboards, scraps of wood and metal scattered across the workbench, and boxes of materials stacked haphazardly in the corners. David was crouched on the floor near the far end of the room, his back to me. He seemed to be shoving something under the workbench, his movements hurried and uncharacteristically clumsy. "David?" I called softly, stepping closer. He startled, glancing over his shoulder with a look of surprise that quickly morphed into something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, Or was it panic? "Sarah," he said, his voice unusually sharp. "I thought you were upstairs." "I heard a noise," I said, pointing toward the spot where he'd been crouched. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he replied quickly, standing and brushing off his hands. His movements were stiff, and his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "I just dropped something." "It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. I glanced at the workbench and noticed a large cloth-covered object partially hidden beneath it. It looked bulky and oddly shaped, and for a moment I wondered if it was some kind of machine or tool I didn't recognize. "What's that?" I asked, gesturing toward the object. David hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's just something I've been working on," he said vaguely. "Nothing important." His evasiveness only fueled my curiosity. "Can I see it?" "Sarah," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's not finished yet. I'll show you when it's ready." There was something in his voice that stopped me from pressing further. David wasn't an argumentative man, but there was a quiet intensity in his tone that told me this was a boundary he wasn't ready for me to cross. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. "Okay," I said, backing off. "But if you need help with whatever it is, just let me know." The seed of suspicion. I returned to the kitchen, but my mind stayed in the basement. What was he hiding under that workbench? And why had he been so secretive about it? David wasn't the kind of person who kept secrets, not that I'd ever known, anyway. We shared everything, from our hopes and dreams to our fears and insecurities. So why did it feel like he was shutting me up now? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. David continued to spend his evenings in the basement, but he seemed more distant than usual. He was still kind and attentive, but there was a certain tension in his demeanor, like he was carrying the weight of something he didn't want me to see. I told myself I was being paranoid. Everyone deserves their own space, right? Maybe I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about privacy. Something was happening, and I couldn't ignore it. An accidental discovery. The turning point came a week later, when I went down to the basement to grab a box of old photo albums. David wasn't home at the time. He'd gone out to run errands, and I figured it was the perfect opportunity to retrieve the box without disturbing his work. As I rummaged through the shelves, my eyes drifted to the workbench. The cloth-covered object was still there, and before I could stop myself, I found my feet moving toward it. My heart raced as I reached out to lift the cloth, my curiosity overpowering my better judgment. What I found beneath it wasn't a tool or a machine. It was something I never could have expected, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my husband. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a secret. It was about understanding the man I loved in a way I never had before. The discovery. When I pulled the cloth back from the object beneath David's workbench, my breath caught in my throat. I expected to find some sort of mechanical contraption, a half-built gadget, maybe something related to his engineering background. But what lay before me was something far more intricate and personal. It was a large wooden box, polished and meticulously crafted, its surface covered in delicate carvings. At first glance, the carvings appeared to be random patterns, but as I studied them, I realized they were depictions of scenes, small, detailed figures etched into the wood with incredible precision. There were images of children playing, a couple sitting on a bench, a family gathered around a table. Each scene radiated a sense of warmth and nostalgia, like tiny snapshots of cherished moments, frozen in time. What struck me most was the craftsmanship. The detail was astonishing, far beyond what I thought David was capable of. I had never known him to carve wood or create anything remotely artistic. He was an engineer, practical, methodical, always focused on solving problems. This box, with its artistry and emotion, felt like a glimpse into an entirely different side of him, a hidden talent. Curiosity overwhelmed me, and I carefully opened the box. Inside, there were compartments lined with velvet, each holding small wooden figurines. They were just as intricate as the carvings on the box, each figure uniquely detailed. I picked one up, a tiny boy holding a kite, and marveled at the craftsmanship. The boy's expression was joyful. The kite string coiled perfectly around his hand. It was a scene that felt alive, as though it captured a real moment in time. There were dozens of figurines, each one telling its own story. A woman holding a bouquet of flowers, a man fishing by a river, a dog leaping to catch a ball. As I examined them, a thought struck me. How long had David been working on this? And why had he kept it hidden? I ran my fingers over the carvings, trying to piece together the meaning behind them. This wasn't just a hobby. It was something deeply personal. It felt like a part of David I had never seen before, a part he had kept hidden for reasons I couldn't yet understand. The weight of the secret. When David came home later that evening, I couldn't stop myself from confronting him. I waited until after dinner, until we were sitting together on the couch with the TV playing in the background. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to him, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. I went down to the basement today. I began, my voice steady but tentative. I was looking for the photo albums, but I saw the box. David froze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I wondered if I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But then he let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I was going to tell you," he said finally, his voice low. I didn't know how." "Tell me what?" I asked, my tone softer now. "David, this is incredible. The carvings, the figurines, they're beautiful. I just don't understand why you kept it a secret." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and vulnerability. "Because it's not something I'm proud of." I frowned, confused. "How could you not be proud of something like that?" "David, it's amazing. It's not just the carvings," he said, shaking his head. "It's what they represent. It's a part of my past I've been trying to leave behind." The truth comes out. David stood up and began pacing the room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I stayed silent, sensing that he needed to gather his thoughts before he could explain. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice tinged with a sadness I had never heard before, "I used to carve things with my grandfather. He was a carpenter, and he taught me everything I know about woodworking. It was our way of bonding. We'd spend hours in his workshop, making little figurines and boxes like the one you saw." I smiled, picturing a young David learning the craft from his grandfather. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "Why would you want to leave that behind?" "Because it wasn't always wonderful," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "After my grandfather passed away, I tried to keep carving. It was the only thing that made me feel close to him. But it became an obsession. I started pouring all my time into it, shutting out the rest of the world. It got to the point where I was carving so much that I stopped focusing on school, stopped hanging out with friends. My parents thought it was unhealthy, and they made me stop." I felt a pang of sadness for him, imagining the pain of losing something so meaningful. "David," I said gently, "it sounds like carving was your way of coping. There's nothing wrong with that." He shook his head. "You don't understand. I wasn't just coping, I was hiding. Hiding from the world, from my responsibilities, from everything. I buried myself in that basement, thinking if I just carved enough, I could bring him back. But it didn't work, and when my parents finally forced me to quit, I promised myself I'd leave it behind and never go back." A new perspective. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. I could see now why he had been so reluctant to share this part of himself. To him, the carvings weren't just art. They were a reminder of a time when he felt lost and disconnected from the world. "But you went back to it," I said softly. "What changed?" David hesitated, then sighed. "It started a few years ago. I found an old carving knife while we were unpacking boxes, and I thought I'd just try it again. For fun, you know. But once I started, it all came flooding back. The memories, the emotions, the connection to my grandfather, it was overwhelming. And I realized I didn't want to let it go again. Then why hide it from me? I asked. David, I'm your wife. You don't have to hide who you are from me. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I was scared. Scared that if I let myself dive back into this world, I'd lose myself again. And scared that you wouldn't understand. A promise to share. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. I do understand, I said. And I think what you've created is incredible. It's a part of who you are, David. You don't have to be ashamed of that. For the first time that evening, he smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. Thank you, he said. That means a lot. From that night on, the box and the carvings were no longer a secret. David began sharing his work with me, showing me the stories behind each figurine and carving. I could see the joy it brought him, the way it helped him reconnect with a part of himself he had buried for so long. And as I watched him, I realized something. The man I thought I knew wasn't just an engineer or a husband. He was an artist, a storyteller, and a man who carried the legacy of his grandfather in every piece he created. A legacy rekindled. The change in David was undeniable. Once the secret of his woodworking was out, it was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I saw him smile more, laugh a little louder, and carry himself with a quiet confidence I hadn't seen in years. His passion, once hidden in the shadows of our basement, now radiated through our home like sunlight streaming through a window. But this newfound openness wasn't without its challenges. The more David embraced his craft, the more it seemed to pull him into its orbit, and I began to realize that uncovering his secret was only the beginning of our journey. The workshop transformed. David's basement, once a cluttered space for his projects, was slowly transforming into a sanctuary of creation. The workbench was no longer just a surface for tools. It became the heart of his newfound artistry. He started organizing his tools meticulously, hanging them on pegboards and labeling drawers with small plaques he carved himself. He invested in better lighting, creating a warm and inviting glow that reflected off the polished wood of his creations. As his confidence grew, so did his ambition. The figurines became more intricate, each one telling a story more vivid than the last. There was a family of ducks swooning across a pond, their feathers so delicately etched that you could almost hear the rustling of water. There was a scene of children playing in the snow, their tiny faces brimming with joy. Each piece was a masterpiece, and it was clear that David was pouring his soul into every detail. I couldn't help but be in awe of his talent. Watching him work was like witnessing a musician lost in a melody or a painter bringing a canvas to life. But along with my admiration came a sense of unease. The deeper David dove into his craft, the more it seemed to consume him. Hours would pass without him coming upstairs, and there were nights when I'd find him asleep at the workbench, his hands still gripping a carving tool. A strain on the relationship. At first, I didn't mind. I was thrilled to see David so passionate about something he loved. But as time went on, I began to feel the strain. Our quiet evenings on the couch, our Sunday walks in the park, even our dinners together, all of it started to slip away as David spent more and more time in the basement. I tried to be understanding, reminding myself that this was important to him. But there were moments when the loneliness crept in, moments when I missed the man who used to sit beside me and share his day. I didn't want to begrudge him his happiness, but I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. One evening, as I sat alone at the dinner table, staring at the untouched plate of food across from me, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I went downstairs, my heart pounding with a mix of frustration and resolve. David was hunched over the workbench, completely absorbed in a figurine he was carving. The sound of the tool against the wood filled the room, and he didn't notice me until I placed a hand on his shoulder. "David," I said softly. He startled, glancing up at me with tired eyes. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't hear you come down." "That's because you've been down here for hours," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Dinner's been ready for over an hour. I waited for you." Guilt flickered across his face, and he set the tool down. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just got caught up in this piece. It's almost finished." "I know this means a lot to you," I said, my voice trembling. "But I miss you, David. I miss us." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand. "I didn't realize how much time I've been spending down here," he admitted. "I don't want you to feel like I'm neglecting you. I just want to feel like we're still in this together," I said. "I love what you're doing, but I don't want it to take you away from me." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "You're right. I've been so focused on this that I'd lost sight of what matters most. I'll make it up to you, Sarah. I promise." Finding balance. True to his word, David began to make changes. He set boundaries for himself, limiting the hours he spent in the basement so that we could have time together as a couple. We brought back our Sunday walks and our quiet evenings on the couch. And when he did work on his carvings, he started inviting me to join him, showing me how to sand the edges of a figurine or stain the wood for a richer finish. I wasn't as skilled as David, but I cherished the moments we spent side by side in the workshop. It became a shared space, a place where we could create together and strengthen the bond that had brought us through so much. But the biggest change came when David decided to share his work with the world. An unexpected opportunity. One day, while we were at a local farmer's market, David noticed a booth selling handmade crafts. The vendor, a cheerful woman named Linda, had a display of hand-painted pottery that drew a steady stream of customers. David watched with quiet fascination, his fingers tracing the edge of a wooden figurine he had brought along as a keepsake. "You should have your own booth," I said, nudging him playfully. "Your work is just as beautiful as hers." David chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm not sure anyone would be interested." "Are you kidding? People would love your carvings. You should give it a try." With some gentle persuasion, David agreed to take the leap. We spent weeks preparing for the market, organizing his figurines, designing a display, and even creating a sign that read "Timeless Carvings by David." When the day of the market arrived, we set up the booth together, arranging the figurines with care and pride. To our surprise, the response was overwhelming. People stopped to admire the intricate details of David's work, marveling at the craftsmanship and the stories each piece seemed to tell. By the end of the day, nearly every figurine had been sold, and David's face was alight with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "I can't believe this," he said, shaking his head as we packed up the booth. "I never thought people would care about something like this." "They care because it's beautiful," I said, smiling at him. "And because it comes from your heart." A new chapter. The success of that first market sparked something in David. He began to see his carvings not just as a personal passion, but as a way to connect with others. He started attending more markets, taking commissions, and even teaching woodworking classes at the local community center. His work brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before, and it brought us closer together as we navigated this new chapter of our lives. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when David created a special figurine for me. A tiny carving of the two of us sitting on a bench, holding hands. It was a simple scene, but it captured everything we had been through. The love, the struggles, the growth, and the promise of a future built on understanding and support. "This is my way of saying thank you," he said as he placed the figurine in my hands, "for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." I held the figurine close, tears filling my eyes. "I always will," I said, "because you're worth it." The masterpiece. David's journey from a man hiding his passion in the shadows of a basement to a celebrated artist in the community was nothing short of extraordinary. Over time, his talent and authenticity began to attract attention far beyond our small town. Each figurine, each carving, carried a story, a piece of him that resonated with others. But even as his popularity grew, David remained the same humble, thoughtful man I had always known. His art had become his way of connecting with the world, but it also became something much more. A symbol of hope, healing, and second chances. An unexpected invitation. One day, as we were sitting together in the workshop, a letter arrived in the mail. It bore the elegant seal of a prestigious art foundation, something I never imagined we'd receive. David opened it with cautious curiosity, his brow furrowing as he read the words. "They want me to showcase my work," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "At a gallery in the city. They're hosting an exhibit on modern craftsmanship, and they want my carvings to be featured." I stared at him in awe, a grin spreading across my face. "David, that's incredible. You have to say yes." He hesitated, the doubt flickering in his eyes. "What if I'm not ready? What if they don't like it?" I placed a hand on his arm, looking him square in the eye. "Your work is beautiful because it comes from your heart. They didn't choose you by accident, David. They see what I see, someone who has something special to share with the world." After a long pause, he nodded, a small smile breaking through his uncertainty. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." The grand reveal. The weeks leading up to the exhibit were a whirlwind of activity. David worked tirelessly, pouring his soul into each piece he selected for the gallery. I helped where I could, offering encouragement, organizing logistics, and reminding him to take breaks when he got lost in his craft. When the day of the exhibit finally arrived, we stood together in the grand hall of the gallery, surrounded by polished wood floors, soft lighting, and walls adorned with David's creations. The gallery buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life wandered through, stopping to admire the intricate details of his carvings. There was a woman holding a bouquet of wildflowers, a boy flying a kite, a family sitting around a dinner table. Each piece told a story, and I could see the emotions in the faces of those who viewed them. Smiles, tears, quiet moments of reflection. As I watched David interact with the visitors, explaining the inspiration behind his work, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had come so far, not just as an artist, but as a person. This wasn't just about the recognition or the applause. It was about David finally embracing the parts of himself he had once been too afraid to share. A surprising connection. Toward the end of the evening, a man approached David, his suit crisp and his demeanor warm. He introduced himself as the director of a non-profit organization that used art to help people heal from trauma. "I've been watching people interact with your work," the man said, gesturing to the carvings. "There's something incredibly moving about what you've created. It's not just art. It's a reminder of the beauty in everyday life, of moments we often take for granted." David listened intently, his expression thoughtful. The man continued, "We work with veterans, abuse survivors, and others who are rebuilding their lives. I think your story and your art could make a real difference for them. Would you consider teaching a workshop for our program?" David's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then he glanced at me, and I nodded encouragingly. "I'd be honored," he said finally. "If my work can help others the way it's helped me, then yes, I'd love to be a part of it." The ripple effect. The workshop was just the beginning. Over the next few years, David's involvement with the nonprofit grew, and so did his impact. He began teaching not just workshops but entire courses, helping people channel their pain and emotions into creativity. His students included people from all walks of life: single mothers, veterans, teenagers struggling to find their way. Each one found solace in the simple act of carving, in the tactile connection to the wood, and in the stories they created with their hands. David's carvings began to appear in more galleries, but it was his work with the nonprofit that truly defined his legacy. The man who had once been afraid to share his passion was now using it to inspire and uplift others, turning his art into a force for good. The masterpiece. One evening, as we were sitting together in the workshop, David handed me a small box. It was polished to perfection, the carvings on its surface more intricate than anything I had seen him create before. "This is for you," he said, his voice soft. I opened the box to find a single figurine inside, a carving of a woman holding a bouquet of flowers, her face etched with kindness and strength. Surrounding her were tiny, delicate carvings of blooming roses and daisies. "It's you," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "You've been my anchor through all of this, Stura. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. This is my way of saying thank you." Tears filled my eyes as I held the figurine, my heart swelling with emotion. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "Thank you, David." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Thank you for seeing me, for supporting me, for never giving up on me. A life well lived." As the years went by, David's legacy only grew. His carvings found their way into homes, galleries, and hearts across the country. But more importantly, his work continued to inspire others to embrace their own creativity and resilience. And through it all, we never lost sight of what mattered most: each other. Our lives weren't defined by perfection or grand gestures, but by the quiet, everyday moments we shared. Laughter over morning coffee, holding hands during evening walks, and the simple joy of being together. David's carvings may have started as a way to honor his grandfather's memory, but they became so much more. A celebration of love, of connection, and of the beauty in life's imperfections. And as I look back on our journey, I realized that the true masterpiece wasn't the art he created, it was the life we built together. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.